Section 6, Return to the Holy Mountain, Ascetic Struggles, Constancy. Yerunda and Father Arsenios left Ornupoli in the beginning of 1933 to resume their intense ascesis on the Holy Mountain. In order to acquire more grace, they started doing 3,000 prostrations every day and isolated themselves on the summit of Mount Athos throughout the summer. Since they only descended when it was necessary to obtain more rusks and olives from one of the monasteries, they would not meet anyone for long periods of time. When winter set in, they would go down into the chapel of the Panagia near their summit and spend the rest of the winter in that frozen chapel, never lighting the stove to keep warm. One characteristic of Yerunda was that he employed every form of ascesis, trying to find out how man can attract the mercy of God. He didn't seek it without orderliness, a method, and a goal, but carefully, with persistence and a program. Since he knew that obedience to an experienced guide is the safest and quickest path, he wanted to be absolutely sure that there was not an experienced guide whom he had not yet found. For this reason, one more time he and Father Arsenios began to explore the caves and skeets of the Holy Mountain in search of such a guide. However, they didn't find one, either because such a guide did not exist, as various monks had told him, or because it wasn't in God's plan for them. Thus Yerunda decided that they would stay in their huts at St. Basil's most of the time and continue their struggle in confinement. This meant that they would need to obtain a little wheat and some rusks, as did all the other monks living in huts. So the next time the boat passed by, they went down to the port of Caricia and bought 130 pounds of wheat. Then each of them tied 65 pounds to his back and set off for the climb to St. Basil's Skeet, which is more than 2,000 feet above sea level. Yerunda was already so exhausted from all the asceses and the continuous fasting that he could barely walk even without a load. After taking a few steps, his strength was exhausted. Since he could tell that he wouldn't be able to proceed any further, he said to Father Arsenios, "I will leave my sack here and will move on because I can't carry it anymore." His exhaustion was so acute that he wondered if he would be able to continue even without a load. So he stopped for a little while and then prayed with tears, saying, "Thou knowest everything, O Lord, and thou art able to help me." Immediately he felt inside himself a consolation, and he realized that the Lord had heard his prayer. Then he tied his load to his back again and said to Father Arsenios, "Let's go now." Father Arsenios gave him a puzzled look, but they set off in silence. Yerunda felt as if someone behind him was carrying all the weight. Abstinence. When they lived as recluses, Yerunda would eat so little food that people today would not believe it. Every day he would eat 3 ounces of rusks after the 9th hour, that is, 3 hours before sunset, or approximately 3 p.m. In this period in their lives, both he and Father Arsenios wanted to eat only bread and water, and only on weekends to have a little food with oil. Their food was a little boiled wheat with lemon or a spoonful of butter, if they had any. They were strict about fasting, doing it with great self-denial. Much later they made this form of ascesis more moderate. Although they ate out of little plates that held only spoonfuls of food, they would eat bread and other food and even fruit if they had any. They ate a variety of foods, albeit in small portions, so that they would not have a high opinion of their level of ascesis and have the temptation to judge others who fasted less than they did. Yerunda weighed not just his food on a scale, but also his bread. He would eat once a day, even if it was Pascha, the Nativity, the day before Lent, or the Dormition of the Panagia, regardless of being worn out by his all-night vigil. He used to say, for a man to obtain freedom from the passions, his flesh must rot, and he must not take death into consideration. In other words, it takes tremendous self-sacrifice to obtain freedom from the passions. He was very careful to preserve this schedule of eating once a day so that his stomach would not encounter irregularities. He knew that this would disturb his bodily peace, which in turn would disturb his peace of soul, and thus he would suffer great damage. Besides, they were already eating very little the rest of the time. That is why he did not keep the customary 3-day fast at the beginning of Lent. Instead, when night began to fall, he had some tea and ate a little bread and rusks. In this way he had moderation and discernment in everything. Yerunda did many Lents. That is, in addition to Great Lent, he would also fast for 40 consecutive days at other times of the year. During these fasts, he would only eat food without oil. When he finished these Lents, he would have some kind of divine vision. For example, once after a long fast, he had a vision and saw before him a plain full of Athonite monks, and almost all of them were caught on something. Most of them were caught by the hands. God enlightened him to realize that they were caught because of their excessive involvement with their handicraft. Self-denial. Yerunda and Father Arsenios lived in great poverty, not just for the ascesis of self-denial, but primarily to help cultivate the prayer, knowing that frugality and simplicity help an ascetic remain free from cares and distractions. Everything they had was always so simple that they never had any difficulty constantly moving from place to place. Yerunda always enforced so much poverty on himself that when he passed away, there was nothing useful for his disciples to inherit. Father Arsenios related the following story about this time in their lives. Once I went to a monastery to get some rusks. The assigned monk gave him a sackful. "It's a lot," I told him. "No, take it," he replied. I had to climb the summit of St. Basil carrying a full sack from the monastery and a bag with various other things. Finally I arrived. We opened it with our elder, and what did we see? It was full of worms. Being only human, I grumbled, "Why didn't that blessed person throw it to the mules? Was it necessary that I go to so much effort for nothing?" Then Yerunda told me, "Why for nothing, Father Arsenios? What will we do with it?" Yerunda replied, "We will eat it. This is what God has given us. If we were worthy of anything better, we would have been given something better." "But Yerunda, what will we do with the worms?" He thought about it a little and said with a bright smile, "I have found the answer. From now on we will eat when it gets dark, and that way we won't see the worms." And that's what happened until we ate it all. In the beginning, I must admit I found it difficult, but what could I do, since that's what Yerunda said? Then believe me, God made it so tasty that it was like we were eating the best sweet. Here's another story Father Arsenios told us about life in those days. One other time, to test me, Yerunda said to me when it was time to eat, "Come, Father Arsenios, let's have our rusks, read the prayers for before a meal." As soon as I had finished reciting the Our Father and was ready to start eating, Yerunda said to me, "Let's pretend that we have already eaten. So say the Thanksgiving prayers for after the meal." This same scenario was repeated 3 or 4 days in a row. By the 4th day, my strength had been exhausted because I worked hard all day and even harder at night keeping vigil. Then I begged Yerunda, "Please, Yerunda, let's not pretend we have already eaten." Then let's eat tonight," he answered. It was with intense struggles like this that the strong Elder Joseph dragged along good old Father Arsenios with his obedience, not for 1 or 2 days, but for almost 40 years. As a recluse, the joys of the desert. In the days before Yerunda acquired a brotherhood, he enjoyed the honey of Hesychas very much. It was his golden era. He and Father Arsenios lived like bodiless angels. Yerunda said about this blessed time, "We had prayer and contact with God. Believe me, I felt so light that it was as if I were a supernatural man. At first they did not do any craft, but lived completely without cares. When their cassocks, with thousands of patches, completely fell apart, some generous monks gave them other cassocks. He lived as a recluse for an entire year, remaining in his tiny cell, which was as dark as a tomb and so narrow that he could barely breathe. He would not go out at all, and every few days Father Arsenios would pass some rusks to him through the window. The reason why he took on this difficult form of ascesis was because he was experiencing an exceptional period of grace, during which his nous was enclosed inside his heart, and he felt great sweetness and an indescribable bliss from the visions God granted him. The tears from the bliss flowed effortlessly like a river. Sometimes his nous would be caught up, and he could not tell if he was in the body or out of the body. He just kept delighting in prayer of the heart. When Yerenda was secluded in his cell, he would say to himself, "Come, my soul, let's occupy ourselves with things above," and he would meditate on heavenly things. Once when doing this, 2 or 3 days passed, and he was still in rapture. These are tremendous spiritual states. What was he meditating on? He was contemplating that we have such a wonderful kingdom of God, paradise. We have the Jerusalem above, the angels, their hymns, the other world. These contemplations of hope give rest to man and make him eager to put off this tabernacle of the body and depart. The amazing thing is that he did not get puffed up with pride because of all those spiritual states and visions. On the contrary, he approached despair because he believed that he had accomplished nothing and had not yet made a beginning. That is why he once wrote, "I have never ceased crying out day and night, seeking the Lord's mercy, and I almost despair, as if I have never done anything, as if I have not yet made a start. But by beginning anew each day, I am found to be a liar and sinner." This was not just empty, humble talk, but true Christ-like humility. He would also bemoan himself when the feast day of the Holy Ascetical Fathers was celebrated, and especially at the feast day of the Holy Athonite Fathers. He would say, "Woe is me, the wretch, who soils and dirties this clean and holy place, a place where the hard-working, weary feet of holy fathers have walked, who sweated, wept, prayed, and attained purity and sanctity here, and I defile this place." Communion from an angel. Even though Elder Joseph was chaste and had not been defiled by the world and could therefore be ordained, he did not want to become a priest because he did not want to be busy doing the services. He preferred to remain free of cares so that he could devote himself to the work of noetic prayer. His yearning for Hesychas was so great that not even the lofty rank of the priesthood appealed to him. Nevertheless, he did not disparage the priesthood at all, since it is the center of all Orthodox ecclesiastical life. He always treated priests and especially bishops with great respect. He said to Father Arsenios, "If we become priests, everyone will tell us, 'Come to this hut to serve, go to that vigil in that skeet, go now to that monastery.' We won't be able to keep our schedule, and so becoming priests won't do us any good. Instead, let's find some priest who can serve the divine liturgy for us now and then so that we can receive the holy mysteries, i.e. communion." In the beginning, Yerenda and Father Arsenios received communion at the hut of the Dormition of the Theotokos, where Papa Bartholomew lived with his own brotherhood. Since, however, their liturgies were not performed at a set schedule, sometimes Yerenda and Father Arsenios arrived at the beginning of the service and other times at the end. This greatly grieved Yerenda, who wanted everything to be done in an orderly fashion so that he could also do his vigil. To avoid being upset by this disorderliness, with great sadness he decided to refrain from attending those liturgies for a period of time until God would present a solution. On a feast day, after 3 months of solitude, he sent Father Arsenios to receive communion. He said to him, "You go. I'm not coming because I can't even drag my feet there. I'll stay here and continue saying the prayer. You go to church." Thus he remained in his little cell with sadness because he would not be able to receive communion. After Father Arsenios left, Yerunda remained hunched over in his dark little cell while saying the prayer with his noose in his heart. Then a thought almost like a grievance came to him, and he said to himself, "You wretch, you are unworthy to receive communion because of your sins. All the other fathers will receive the holy mysteries, while you are worthless, and will not." As he sat there weeping and bewailing himself, suddenly his cell filled with light. The ceiling opened, and a young man with wings descended and stood before him. It was an angel of the Lord. I could barely see him, Yerunda told us later, since his face was like lightning. The angel put his hand in his bosom and pulled out a beautiful little round box that was overflowing with otherworldly light. Then the angel carefully opened the box, and he motioned to him to prepare himself as he took a piece of the holy bread with a spoon. In his own words, this is what happened next. Overwhelmed by both the influence of this spiritual phenomenon and the mysterious grace of the vision, without thinking, since at times like this man stops thinking and perceiving in his usual manner, I involuntarily realized that what God wanted me to do. I opened my mouth, and the angel gave me communion, saying, "The servant of God, monk Yosef, receives the body and blood of Christ." Then the angel smiled modestly at me, closed the box, and ascended through the ceiling. After this it was dark in my cell once again. So I lowered my head and began to pray again. I felt more joy, bliss, and grace than I had ever experienced. For an entire week I did not feel the need for food or drink. It was as if my regular bodily functions had stopped. Yerunda was, for us monks of the 8th millennium, a tremendous support because with his life he attested to and crowned the lives of the watchful fathers. When a modern-day Christian reads that famous ascetics in the desert have been counted worthy of receiving communion from angels, he might doubt the veracity of such accounts because he has never met such people and because of today's prevailing spiritual laxity. Yet behold that even in our day there have been brave souls with a fiery yearning for God, deep humility, and great ascetics and self-denial, who have been counted worthy of the same gifts. In this manner, Yerunda's example teaches us with a powerful voice that sanctity and the charismas of the great Holy Fathers are achievable in every era, even in ours. Clairvoyance. At St. Basil's Skeet, in the seclusion of his cell, Yerunda often knew what was happening in the outside world better than those who take pains to find out about such things. One day, Father Matthew, who was the leader of a group of zealots to whom Yerunda belonged, began professing some extremist positions. He was an accomplished speaker and enticed many with his opinions. But when Yerunda heard these views of his, he became concerned and began to pray to God about him. After a while, God revealed the truth to Yerunda in a vision. I saw that there were two roads that the fathers had mapped out, the Cenobitic and the ascetical. And I saw that brother was following neither the one nor the other road, but said, "I will go here." Then he went downhill through a thicket that descended to the sea. And there was someone beside him who said to me, "Do you see him? The road he took will take him to the depths." At the same time, I also saw that I was at St. Basil's, up in the Skeet. I saw a dreadful fire burning the entire Skeet. So I said with grief, "Who lit this fire which will burn down the entire Skeet?" Then someone told me, "Father Matthew lit it, trying to support his way of thinking." This vision made Yerunda realize that things were not well with Father Matthew's way of life, and it made Yerunda question also his ecclesiastical stance. Yerunda and Father Arsenios lacked even the most basic necessities in the wilderness of St. Basil's Skeet. Nevertheless, they struggled with great forcefulness, which is why they had much grace in their noetic prayer and experienced many divine spiritual states. God revealed many of his ineffable mysteries to them because they fought with all their might and endured many afflictions out of love for him. God consoled Yerunda with visions because he was experiencing heavenly spiritual states without having anyone to discuss them with or who could understand him. As a result, he had to keep everything bottled up inside. He had Father Arsenios, of course, but Father Arsenios was very simple-minded. Later in life, when Yerunda moved to a place with a more moderate climate where he fasted less strictly, he admitted that he no longer had the lofty states of prayer he had experienced when he was at St. Basil's Skeet. Yerunda's experience in the spiritual struggle taught him not to reveal his inner spiritual state to anyone so that the demons would not know how to fight him. That is why he taught, whether you feel like you're in heaven or hell, don't show it. We need to appear impassive. Usually Yerunda would not tell us about his own spiritual state. For example, if he had just seen a vision, he wouldn't mention it. Only later when we were overwhelmed by some difficulty or needed consolation would he bring it up and say, "Don't despair. We have a great God who watches over us, and it is through afflictions that we approach him." It was after the cross that God rose and ascended into heaven in the flesh. After afflictions follow consolations, visions, and revelations to the suffering soul. They don't come during times of happiness, but when the soul is being strangled by bitter afflictions and attacks of infernal darkness. And then he would tell us one or two visions to illustrate his point and fortify us. Spiritual warfare. Battles with demons. Throughout his life, Elder Joseph fought tooth and nail with the demons. Those apostates of God's love fought against him in various ways, sometimes with thoughts, other times with illnesses that God allowed, and other times with their visible presence. Later they manipulated weaker brethren and disciples of his and made him bear the burden of their temptations. One winter night, Yerunda and Father Arsenios were in their hut up in St. Basil's Skeet while a snowstorm raged outside. The wind was howling fiercely and the cold pierced them to the bone. Even so, they followed their program and struggled with their vigil, the remembrance of death, tears of repentance, thousands of prostrations, and primarily noetic prayer. This did not please the jealous devil at all, so he raised a series of attacks against Yerunda, with thoughts, fantasies, distractions, noises, threats, or anything else he could think of. He tried 3 or 4 times to ruin Yerunda's vigil, but all his attacks failed because by then Yerunda was an experienced fighter. Finally, the devil became so infuriated with him that he entered through the door in the form of a violent burst of wind. He threw the door aside and then lifted the roof into the air. Yerunda remained thunderstruck in his hut watching the roof with tons of rock on top of it flying through the air like a glider. There had been strong winds before, but what happened that night was not just a strong gust of wind, but a demon. The roof crashed onto the rocks on the other side of a ravine, and the remains of the roof became a pitiful sight on top of the snow. As a result, the 2 ascetics ended up being exposed to the snowstorm. Despite this, they still didn't end their vigil. What did they do to keep from freezing? They did prostrations all night long. When a monk came the next morning and found them with snow in their cells and even in their beards, perplexed, he asked, "What happened here, my child?" Elder Joseph replied, "Don't trust in man, trust in God." Another time, Yerunda was keeping vigil saying the prayer, and a demon appeared before him. Apparently the demon's intent was to start beating him up. But Yerunda was so brave and had so much fury against the demons that he immediately charged at him to crush him. After wrestling a little with the demon, Yerunda managed to get a good hold on him, and then he called out to Father Arsenios, "Arsenios, bring some fire so we can burn him. Now that I've got him, he's not getting away." But while Father Arsenios was trying to light a fire, the demon transformed himself into a crow and flew away. These stories may sound trivial, but only people who have experienced tangible demonic assaults can fully appreciate Elder Joseph's courage and bravery. Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who had experienced numerous demonic appearances, found it sufficient merely to say about them, "They are atrocious." During their blessed life at St. Basil's Skeet, Yerunda's demonic warfare continued relentlessly. One day, Mr. Sotirios Skoinianas came from the world to see him. Up there in those abrupt precipices, however, they didn't have any place for him to stay, so Yerunda had him sleep in his own cell while he went to their little chapel to do his vigil. That evening the demons came to Yeranda's cell as usual. When they started beating the visitor, he started screaming. The man was horrified. He almost lost his mind. As soon as Yeranda and Father Arsenios heard the screams, they came running and asked him, "What's wrong?" "The demons nearly strangled me," he said. "They almost beat me to death." Indeed, he was black and blue from their hits. "Don't be afraid," Yeranda told him. "They won't hit you again. Every evening they beat me, but tonight they thrashed you by mistake." The visitor fell at Yeranda's feet in tears and begged him, "Take me back to St. Anne's quickly. I can't stay here anymore." Yeranda told him cheerful things to calm him down a bit, but it was impossible. He could not stay in that place of martyrdom. He was terrified and kept looking left and right, begging to leave. So in the middle of the night, Yeranda led him through the ravines back to St. Anne's. At the outset of their ascetical life, both Yeranda and Father Arsenios frequently tormented by the demons, but it was primarily Yeranda who was beaten up, because it was his prayer that really burned them. They didn't attack Father Arsenios so much, partly because he was not on the same level as Yeranda, but especially because he was a disciple. When a disciple is properly obedient and confesses frankly, he eliminates the demon's right to attack him. Yeranda, on the other hand, had an unending struggle throughout his entire life. Years later, he wrote to someone, "I have been furiously and bloodily wrestling with the demons for more than 25 years in this world. I have descended to the bottom of the sea, devoid of any complacency and self-will, in order to find the pearl of great price. I conquered Satan himself, along with all his army, skill and cunning. Having shackled him through humility, I asked him, 'Why do you have so much rage towards us and fight us with so much fury?' And he answered, 'So that I may have many companions in Hades, and brag to the Nazarene, I am not the only transgressor. See how many others are with me.' Then once again I ascended to the heavens through grace and spiritual theoria, and saw the ineffable beauty of paradise, which God has prepared for them that love him. And after all this, grace was lifted away a little, and my feet were well nigh shaken. Then I fell into a little negligence, and sleep took me captive and deprived me of many blessings. Shortly thereafter I rose once again and waged war in a bloody battle. But after I won, I fell into drowsiness, and once more negligence, the mother of every evil, began to eat away at my bones. Yet once again I rose and waged war against all the spirits." His temptations were so severe, many times he told us, "If I describe to you my struggles with temptations, you will not be able to bear it, because my entire life has been a martyrdom. But the goodness of God and Our Lady the Theotokos, who always protected me, gave me a kind of persistence and toughness so that I would not yield. In difficult times, what really helps and saves you is tears, but everything depends on the goodness of God." During his great trials, Yeranda experienced the grace of God tangibly. This was because God's response is proportional to the magnitude of the temptation that one bears for his love. When a person works for God with very good intentions, it is not possible that God will let him be tempted beyond his strength. Furthermore, his reward from God will also correspond to the magnitude of the temptation. This is why Yeranda wrote, "Don't be surprised. That is how a monk is. The life of a monk is a continuous martyrdom. Our sweet Jesus reveals himself through afflictions." As St. Isaac the Syrian says, "God does not grant a great gift without a great trial." St. Isaac also warns us, "But if a man's soul has an infirmity and has not strength enough for great temptations, and she therefore asks that she should not enter into them, and God hearkens to her, then know for certain that inasmuch as the soul is insufficient for great trials, in the same measure is she insufficient for great gifts, and in so far as great temptations are prevented from entering upon the soul, to the same degree great gifts are withheld from her." This means that whoever wants to experience great grace from God must be patient with temptations. He must hold the battlefront with trust in God. Battle against self-love. While Yeranda was at St. Basil's Skeet, he struggled hard against self-love. As a part of this struggle, he had only one set of clothes which he never changed, since he perspired very much during his vigil. While praying noetically, his body developed some kind of allergic rash. His entire back filled with pimples that were extremely itchy. He felt as if his back were on fire, like a fish in a skillet, but even so he didn't pay any attention to it. If it started bothering him very much, he would rub his back against the wall, and this would make those pimples burst. With this kind of treatment, it's no wonder his health deteriorated to the point where his back became as stiff as wood. He was unable to bend his back at all. Apparently, the open wounds from that rash became infected because those pimples grew quite large and full of pus. Despite all that, he never cared for himself and left everything to God's providence. One day he went to Iveron Monastery to exchange brooms for some rusks. Since it was far away and he perspired profusely, the rash bothered him very much, but he did not give in. As an ascetic, he viewed yielding as a lack of faith in God. Later, though, near the end of his life, when he was full of experience and discernment, he reconsidered his views about doctors and medicine. But in his early years, accepting medical treatment would have been contrary to his character. His motto was fight till death. If you're prepared for death, then you accept every affliction with ease. Thus Yerunda loaded up on his back a large sack of rusks and set off from Iveron Monastery for St. Basil's Skete. It is so far that even if he had walked quickly and left the monastery early in the morning, he would not have arrived at his hut until nightfall. On the way he could tell that his pimples had burst because he could feel his undershirt sticking to his back and pus running down his legs. But he didn't even bother to take a look at what was happening. He left it all to the providence of God. When he finally arrived and unloaded his sack, then he felt the wounds on his back. They were so large that a lemon could fit inside them. Despite this, he still didn't examine them any further, but left it to God. As time passed, his wounds gradually healed, but the indentations they made remained until the end of his life. Such were the supernatural struggles of this young ascetic against self-love. He never mentioned this incident to anyone. It was discovered only near the end of his life when Yerunda was bedridden. Because of his illness, he allowed a disciple of his to wipe him with a towel. That disciple noticed the marks of the wounds that had healed, which were round like suction cups of an octopus. He asked him what they were, since he knew that Yerunda was never wounded in battle, and then Yerunda explained what had happened. Yerunda used to say, "The struggle against self-love is hard, but everything is accomplished with the grace of God. If a person, especially a beginner, is not strict with himself, cowardice and self-love take the wind out of his sails. And if a person does not jump into the sea of temptations with faith and without hesitating, he will not find tangible help from God, and thus will not even make one step of progress. Therefore do not be cowardly, especially now in the beginning, so as to attract the grace of God. Grace has the habit of comforting those with certain faith who dive into the sea of self-denial for the sake of love and God's commandments. When one's nous is finally informed of the presence of help given to those who believe, then one enters into another kind of faith, which is not the introductory faith that every believer has, but as the Holy Fathers call it, the faith of theoria of the perfect. This is the first stage at which a man begins to differ from the rest. Furthermore, he emphasized that if a beginner ascetic does not succumb to the mockery of the ignorant and indolent people, and if he does not make compromises, he then proceeds with confidence on the straight and narrow path of the unseen and unknown confessors. He will be blessed if he has an unerring elder who will guide him, support him, and comfort him, that by the grace of God he is progressing in virtue. Yerunda said, "In the initial years of my struggles I didn't have a guide who could understand me, and I suffered greatly from the ignorance, the reproaches, and the mockery of those who were constantly around me." Battle against anger. Not even once did Elder Joseph ever give in to the provocations of anger, but through self-criticism and prayer he choked everything within himself. In this manner, by God's grace, he finally attained the complete deadening of his passion. Once, when he was exhausted by hunger, Yerunda said, "Come on, Arsenios, let's go to Kutlumassiu monastery where they are having their feast day celebration, so that we can eat a little fish and regain our strength." This monastery is located in the center of the holy mountain, near Kyries, and celebrates on August 6th the Transfiguration of the Lord. The two ascetics enjoyed the festal vigil and were ready to go along with everyone else into the refectory to celebrate. The bells rang for the festal meal in the refectory, and everyone made a venerable procession from the church. The bishop and the abbot led, while all the rest of the fathers and pilgrims followed. Yerunda and Father Arsenios, however, were dirty and barefoot, wearing ragged cassocks full of patches. As soon as they reached the refectory doors, the others said to them, "Get out of here! Out!" They threw them out and locked the doors. Apparently their ascetical apparel was inappropriate for the festal splendor. This ousting was of course offensive. Father Arsenios flared up with anger. "How dare those monks lock us out?" "Peace," Yerunda said to him. "Be very careful, because otherwise all the reward we gained from the vigil will be lost now. Come here and I'll show you what we'll do. Not only will we eat some fish, but we'll also keep our reward by not getting angry." Yerunda was very polite. He took Father Arsenios around the back of the kitchen and said, "Bless, brethren, could you please give us a little food?" Yes, of course, fathers," and they gave them plenty of food. "See, Father Arsenios, we not only ate, but they even gave us extra to take with us, and we didn't get angry with the other fathers." In the beginning, Father Arsenios easily lost his temper, but Yerunda was solid like a rock in patience and meekness. Because Father Arsenios was a forceful monk, it wasn't long before he managed to imitate his elder in this way. This is what was amazing about Father Arsenios. Whenever he saw a virtue in Yerunda, he immediately began struggling to acquire it as well. On the contrary, even though we, the contemporary generation of monks, read countless patristic books, we still haven't even made a beginning in our monastic struggle, with the exception of a few. Battle against idle talk. Elder Joseph understood the value of silence very well. He would later teach his disciples that silence is the greatest and most fruitful virtue, which is why the God-bearing fathers named it sinlessness. Its first fruit is the death of idle talk, then comes mourning according to God, and then follow luminous, humble thoughts that will bring the holy stream of life-giving tears. Silence and Hesychas are one and the same thing. On the other hand, talkativeness drives away everything good. That is why Elder Joseph cultivated this mother of the virtues intensely throughout his life. Once he had some matter to take care of at the Great Lavra because St. Basil's skete was under its jurisdiction. When he arrived at the monastery gate, several fathers happened to be there talking. As soon as they saw him, whose reputation as an ascetic preceded him, they wanted to test him. The Athonite fathers, as heirs of ascetical experience, know very well that people who are deluded or who are sham ascetics are always proud, self-willed, and talk back. "Come here," they said to him. "Eulogison," replied Yerunda. Sit down here in the middle. May it be blessed. Now, get up and leave." They were testing him to see if he would get angry. "May it be blessed." Afterwards the fathers said with amazement, "Now that is a monk." Whenever Yerunda wanted to go somewhere with Father Arsenios, they walked about 20 yards apart and repeated out loud, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me." They didn't walk together so that the demon of idle talk wouldn't defeat them and drag them into criticism and so many other evils. The demons grab every opportunity to throw men in. Whenever Yerunda and Father Arsenios met someone, they would say, "Bless," with a slight bow, and then continue saying the prayer out loud. What could the other person say? Nothing. Father Arsenios, who was simple, was not quite as careful. So when an unfamiliar monk passed by while they were talking, he would ask him, "How are you, my brother?" And then a little conversation would begin. "How's so-and-so doing? Is he doing any handicraft?" In other words, Father Arsenios began talking idly. In the meantime, Yerunda could hear the conversation, but waited patiently. When Father Arsenios saw Yerunda looking pensive, he said to himself, "Now I'm in trouble." As soon as the other monk left, Yerunda went up to Father Arsenios and said, "So what happened, Father Arsenios? Did you confess him? Is he able to become a priest?" "I spoke idly again, forgive me. Logison." Even though he was older, Father Arsenios recognized what was correct and admitted later, If Yerunda hadn't strictly corrected me all the time, I would have been lost. Whenever they got tired from walking a long distance and didn't have time to return to their hut, Father Arsenios would ask, should we go to someone's hut and stay the night? Yerunda would answer, no, we won't, Father Arsenios, because if we do, we'll lose our prayer, we'll speak idly, and we'll hear things that are beneficial. We might even start judging someone after hearing things concerning other people. It would be better for us to stay outside in the cold and do our vigil and our prostrations out here rather than judge others. Besides, we certainly wouldn't hear anything spiritual. What a fighting spirit. They preferred to sit out in the cold, in the frost, in the rain, rather than seek hospitality at someone's hut and risk speaking idly. Many times when they wanted to go to Kyries or somewhere else, they made an agreement that they would not eat, drink, or speak until they returned to their hut, and only then would they eat and drink. Father Arsenios told us later, we went to Kyries, took care of our business, and returned, and we weren't hungry, thirsty, or tired, and we didn't even speak idly. Such is the power of faith and silence. In order to avoid idle talk, Yerunda rarely traveled by boat around the holy mountain unless they were a pressing need. When he did go by boat, he would bend his head down and constantly say the prayer, Kyrie Jesu Christe eleison me, Kyrie Jesu Christe eleison me. When some monk approached him and asked him, how are you, Father Yosef? How's Father Arsenios doing? Yerunda would reply, fine, evlogite, Kyrie Jesu Christe eleison me. In this way he cut him off politely. This is how precise Yerunda was in avoiding idle talk. This is how he lived, and this is what he taught his disciples. Yerunda and Father Arsenios were holy and found the grace of God because they labored, struggled, and fought, which shows their steady determination. End of section 6. Section 7, his first brotherhood. Father John. His reputation grows. Despite Elder Joseph's attempts to remain unknown, his reputation as a great ascetic began to spread. As a result, various laymen and monks started to come to him with the desire to become his disciples. Even though he was unhappy about losing his peace and quiet, he didn't have the heart to send them away. He welcomed them all with the hope of passing on to them some of the treasure he had found. The first layman to become his disciple was from northern Epirus. His job as a layman was to burn wood and make charcoal. Yerunda made him a great schema monk and named him John. As time passed, however, Father John fell away from precise obedience. Yerunda said to him, Father John, do some more prostrations. I can't, Yerunda, he answered. Since Yerunda saw that Father John wasn't succeeding in doing his spiritual responsibilities, and since he knew that idleness is the mother of all evils for a monk, he said to Father John, Fine, then do some handicraft because we have expenses. I can't, Yerunda. What could Yerunda tell him? You can't force someone to become holy. So he gave in and said to him, Fine, my child, do whatever you can. Father John was constantly disobedient, and Yerunda was very sad about that. Since Father John wouldn't listen to his advice, Yerunda left the matter to God and prayed for him. Demonic delusion. A true disciple is not afraid of falling into delusion, because the humility of obedience eliminates the right of the demons to delude him. When the evil enemy of our salvation saw the disobedience of this young disciple, he seized the opportunity and laid a trap for him. One night while Father John was sleeping, a demon knocked on his door and said, Through the prayers, get up, brother, and say your prayers. The cunning demon did say the words through the prayers, but he didn't dare say the rest of that customary prayer, Of our holy fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on us and save us. He only said the initial words that do him no harm through the prayers. Since the voice was telling him to do something good, Father John thought it must be his guardian angel, and he puffed up with pride. He thought to himself, finally I have reached a high spiritual level. So he got up and began doing his vigil with zeal. But he didn't tell Yerunda anything. The next evening the same thing happened. This was repeated every evening in exactly the same way. Once the demon had filled him with pride, he also gave him zeal to pray, since prayer without humility is nothing in God's eyes. Father John believed that he was speaking with his guardian angel. After some time had passed and the demon could see that Father John had swallowed the bait, he started teaching him ineffable mysteries. The monk couldn't see the demon. He could only hear his voice. Naturally, one of the first things the hater of man taught him was the following: "Be sure not to tell your elder that I speak with you and teach you heavenly things, because then I will disappear and you will lose my help." Father John thought to himself, rather than losing my angel, I'll be better off not saying anything to Yerunda. Thus, free from Yerunda's intervention, the demon was able to weave his web deftly. So Father John stopped confessing his thoughts to Yerunda for a while. But Yerunda, as his spiritual father, was concerned with this change of behavior, and he asked him, "How are you doing, Father John?" "Well, very well." "Don't you have any thoughts you would like to confess?" No, I'm just fine." Respecting his reply, Yerunda didn't probe any further, but intensified his prayer about it. Since Father John had rejected God's help by not speaking to his elder, the demon thought, "He's mine now, I will finish him off." A few days later, the demon said to him, "Tomorrow is Sunday. After going to church in the morning, go to such a place, and I shall take you from there to heaven. I shall take you up in a fiery chariot to the Holy Trinity, just like the prophet Elias, and you will become paradise and many other things." In the meantime, Yerunda, who was praying hard for Father John, felt very uneasy about him, and he called him into his cell and asked him to confess his thoughts. At first he refused and claimed that he didn't have any thoughts to confess, but Yerunda put him on the spot, and then he admitted with hemming and hawing, "I'm sorry, Yerunda. Through your prayers I have been counted worthy to pray together with my guardian angel every evening for a while now. We agreed that tomorrow morning, after receiving communion at Papa Matthew's chapel, I would go to such and such a place, and the prophet Elias will descend to receive my soul with his fiery chariot." "Did your guardian angel perhaps tell you not to tell me anything?" "Yes, he did." He barely finished saying these words when Yerunda like lightning slapped him hard. "You deluded idiot! Satan had you in his grasp and was about to toss you down some cliff. You would have ended up in hell, and you weren't going to tell me anything?" "But Yerunda, how could it be demonic? If it were an angel of God, why would he tell you not to say anything to me, your elder? An elder works together with the angels because he too is a servant of God, as are the angels. For him to tell you not to reveal anything means that he was not an angel, but an evil demon who wanted to drown your soul. So, my child, go back to your cell. You're not going to church in the morning, and now we'll see if he ever comes back." Yerunda's words and his slap shook him up. Whether he liked it or not, he had to be obedient and went back to his cell. Yerunda's prediction became true. The demon did not come back as an angel of God, but as he was in reality, a black demon. He said to Father John, enraged, "Didn't I tell you, you filthy monk, not to tell our secret to Yerunda?" As soon as Father John saw and heard this, he shuddered. He immediately ran to Yerunda, fell at his feet, and confessed everything to him with much gratitude. Behold what a spiritual guide does. God's enlightenment and Yerunda's experience did not let Father John be lost. We must have complete trust in our spiritual guide, because all elders and spiritual fathers keep a vigilant watch over the souls of their spiritual children. In every battle a disciple has, his spiritual father is right there with him. When a disciple is completely obedient to his spiritual father, elder, and guide, this obedience is transferred to God, who accepts it and rewards it with his abundant grace. Later, Father John had intense carnal warfare and couldn't control himself. Yerunda gave him a strict regimen of prayer, while Yerunda himself also fasted and prayed hard for him. After 2 months, Father John was healed and was not bothered by that warfare again. Despite this, it wasn't long before he started doing other things displeasing to Yerunda. Yerunda and Father Arsenios dug 2 graves for themselves, because they wanted to stay in them in order to concentrate on prayer. Yerunda told Father John, "Father Arsenios and I are going to stay in these graves and pray. We have enough rusks to eat, but we will need water to survive. Can you bring us some water every day?" Father John objected. "What do you think I am, a donkey?" Yerunda looked at with disappointment. Disobedience. Once a young man who wanted to become a monk under Yerunda came and said, "Yerunda, I revere you and love you very much, and I want to become a monk." "May you become one," Yerunda replied. "Christ did not turn away anyone. You can have this cell, and there's your bed. From now on you will be obedient." A few days later, though he began disobeying and showed no sign of wanting to correct himself, after seeing his behavior, Yerunda said to him, "Come here, my child, gather your clothes and be on your way. If you are already doing your own will now, tomorrow you will climb all over our backs." Yerunda tolerated the weaknesses of prospective disciples only up to a certain point. After that he became extremely strict. This, of course, was out of love. He would tell them once, twice, 3 times, and no more. Father Athanasios, his talents. As we already mentioned, Father Athanasios, whose name in the world was Nicholas, was Yerunda's brother, 10 years younger than Yerunda. He came and joined Yerunda immediately after he recovered from his Navy accident around the middle of 1933. He was exceptionally well educated for his time, a top graduate of graduate business school, and an excellent calligrapher. Music was also among his other talents. In the world, he knew Western music and played the violin. When he came to the Holy Mountain, he learned Byzantine music very well from Elder Modestos, and he had an excellent voice. He had so much vocal endurance that he could chant and read an entire vigil on his own, which lasted 7 to 8 hours. Despite his enviable academic qualifications, he had great humility and did not attach any importance to them. He was so indifferent to them that he could barely even recall which subjects he had studied. Furthermore, he had astounding physical strength and stamina. Because of this, he, more than anyone else, went around on foot to the monasteries and skeets to care for the brotherhood's necessities. He could take their handicrafts and give them to monasteries in exchange for food, clothes, and whatever else they needed. He labored for years on end, even though he had a heart problem and hereditary bronchial asthma. He wore a tattered cassock full of all kinds of patches. He always held a large, frayed prayer rope in his hand, and he said the prayer as he walked. To avoid meeting various monks and the ensuing idle talk, he usually traveled at night. Whoever has walked at night through the crags and the stony paths of the Holy Mountain knows how dangerous that is. God only knows how he didn't slip and fall down a cliff. The old ascetics of Mount Athos still remember him walking at night with a huge sack on his back, which was as large as a cabinet. He tired himself out so much by hauling so many things around that in the end his legs became bowed. Referring to all the toil his brother did walking at night, Yerunda said, "Someday they will write a book about the Holy Mountain, and in it they will tell what Father Athanasios was like." "Hey, Yerunda, don't say that. I'm nothing but trash. But what a monk you are. What path is there that you haven't traversed with a load on your back?" His weakness. Father Athanasios didn't have the same ascetical sense of self-sacrifice as Yerunda, but he still offered his valuable services. By doing all the necessary tasks himself, he gave Yerunda and Father Arsenios the freedom to occupy themselves with the hesychistic life and noetic prayer. Although Father Athanasios had superhuman physical stamina and worked hard, he was weak in the warfare against thoughts. He didn't say the prayer constantly, as Yerunda taught, which is why he was plagued by that warfare. Not only that, but he was also disobedient many times because he wanted to do things his own way. As a result, he would fall into hopelessness and despair. Fortunately for him, he had Yerunda who supported him. Not only did Yerunda and Father Arsenios pray for Father Athanasios, but also Papa Ephraim of Katonakia did. Once Yerunda said, "Today I prayed so hard for Thanasi that it is just not possible that God won't have mercy on him." Spiritual fatherhood is a difficult struggle. A spiritual father must not only continuously give a good example, but he must also constantly bear the weaknesses of his spiritual children. How arduous and laborious the position of the spiritual father is, with its great responsibilities. As St. John Chrysostom puts it, governing souls is more toilsome than anything else. The lot of a spiritual father is full of cares, labors, temptations, afflictions, sighs, fears, worries, agony, prayer, tearful supplication, teaching, imploring, and reprimanding. A spiritual father and an elder suffer hell until Christ is formed in the souls of their spiritual children. Every person is different. They can be as different as iron and cotton. Some souls are easily persuaded, while others need the fire of temptations to soften. The more difficult a disciple's character is, the more painful the work of a spiritual father is. This is why Yeranda wrote from experience, "It would be wonderful if everyone had a good character, humility, and obedience, but if one's nature happens to be tougher than iron, he should not despair. He needs to struggle, and by the grace of God he can win. God is not unjust in his expectations. He seeks repayment according to the gifts he has given." Being human, Father Athanasios sometimes went astray, but God saw the toil he was doing for the brotherhood, especially his persistence in repentance and correcting his mistakes. Sometimes Yeranda would get up and would be about to slap him, but Father Athanasios would say, "Hit me here so I die." Despite his weak character, Father Athanasios offered valuable services to Yeranda. Father Athanasios' great feat was that even though he had so many difficulties with his spiritual life, he still didn't leave Yeranda. Instead, he remained under obedience like a martyr until the end. Thus, through constantly falling and getting up and making a new beginning, he achieved the awareness of his weakness. Because of this realization, he was patient with Yeranda's continuous discipline. In this way, he attained deep humility, on which he established his great self-denial. Frequently, other monks would say that Father Athanasios was a real angel. Yeranda would reply, "He is an angel, but be careful not to step on his wings." He said that because Father Athanasios got angry when contradicted.